Edgar Cayce was never just a medium, called the sleeping prophet. He accessed information in a trance state that defied logic, science, and even traditional spirituality. His readings, given between 1901 and 1944, covered topics ranging from energy healing to maps of lost civilizations. But among the thousands of archive records, there is a set of readings that was kept in silence, not for lack of interest, but for excessive risk. These readings do not speak of diseases, nor of Atlantis. They speak of an object, a celestial body, an impact, and a date, 2025. During a session in 1934, Cayce reportedly mentioned a flaming rock that crosses the skies and touches the earth where man has built with pride. The phrase, recorded in symbolic language, was ignored for decades. But in 1998, a group of independent researchers began cross-referencing his readings with astronomical events. What they found was disturbing. Cayce's description matched the trajectory of an object called 2001FO32, an asteroid that, according to NASA, passed close to Earth in March 2021. But the group realized that Cayce was not speaking of that object. He was speaking of another, one not yet detected, one that would come later, one that would arrive in 2025. The prophecy, according to these scholars, was not about destruction. It was about choice. Cayce said that the sky does not destroy, it only reveals what is hidden. And this revelation, according to decoded texts, would come with a test, a collective test, a vibrational test, because the impact would not be merely physical. It would be energetic, and the Earth, as a field of consciousness, would have to respond, not with technology, but with frequency. And this frequency, according to the records, would be linked to a figure who would emerge from the center of power, but outside the order, a figure who would divide, provoke, but also activate. And so, those who study these readings began to ask, could Donald Trump be that figure? The idea seems absurd at first glance. Cayce never mentioned names, but the vibrational codes he used, patterns of language, symbols, archetypes, point to someone who represents rupture, someone who challenges structures, someone who, even unknowingly, activates fields. And Trump, with his trajectory marked by controversy, polarization, and unexpected decisions, seems to fit this archetype, not as a savior, but as a catalyst, because, according to the text, the catalyst is not the one who resolves, it is the one who forces a choice. And the impact, according to Cayce, would force that choice. In 2023, a group of amateur astronomers detected an object off the conventional route. Provisionally named Cayce 25, the celestial body showed unusual characteristics, variable speed, unstable electromagnetic field, and an oscillating trajectory. NASA did not officially confirm it, but leaked documents indicated concern, not about direct impact, but about vibrational interference. Because, according to calculations, the object would not collide with Earth, but would pass so close that it could alter the planet's magnetic field. And this alteration, according to Cayce's text, would activate forgotten memories, hidden patterns, and collective choices. Trump, in this scenario, does not appear as a traditional leader. He appears as a symbolic figure, a piece of a larger board, someone who, by provoking ruptures, forces the system to reveal itself. And those who study the hidden texts know the system only changes when it is forced to see itself. And Trump, with his polarizing presence, forces that gaze, not by intention, but by function, because, according to Cayce, what divides also reveals. And the revelation, in this case, is about what humanity chooses in the face of impact. Cayce's prophecy is not about the end, it is about crossing. He said that the fire from the sky does not burn, it purifies. And this purification, according to the records, would come with chaos, confusion, and choice. And those who are awake already know the chaos has begun, not in the skies, but in the institutions, not in the rocks, but in the ideas. And Trump, with his paradoxical trajectory, seems to be the mirror of this chaos, the mirror that forces the world to see itself, the mirror that, when faced, activates the field. Perhaps, looking at all this, we can understand that Cayce was not speaking of destruction. he was speaking of activation. And the meteor of 2025, whether physical or vibrational, is only the trigger that forces humanity to choose between repeating or transcending, between denying or integrating, between surviving or awakening. And Trump, with all his paradoxes, is merely the reflection of that choice. Because, as those who hear the hidden text say, the impact will not be on the ground, it will be in consciousness. And that consciousness has already begun to move. The sky on alert and the guardians of silence. The sky began to behave strangely, not only through visible phenomena, but through vibrational patterns that escape ordinary perception. Since the end of 2024, independent observatories have recorded oscillations in Earth's electromagnetic field, especially during periods of planetary alignment. What seemed at first to be mere solar variation revealed itself to be part of a larger pattern, a pattern that, according to those who study the forgotten readings of Edgar Cayce, corresponds to the awakening of the celestial veil. And this veil, according to the text, will be torn not by destruction, but by revelation, the object informally named Cayce. 25 is not just a meteor. It is a vibrational catalyst. Its approach does not provoke panic among those who observe with physical eyes, but it unsettles those who listen with the field. For according to the records, what comes from the sky does not bring an end, it brings a choice. And this choice, say the decoders, is being quietly prepared by institutions that never appear in the headlines. The Vatican, for instance, has undertaken discrete movements since early 2025. Archives have been collected, relics have been transferred, priests trained in symbolism have been dispatched to specific regions of the planet, not to pray, but to listen. NASA, in turn, remains silent. The object does not appear in official bulletins, yet leaked internal documents indicate concern, not about physical impact, but about interference with the magnetic field. For according to calculations, Cayce 25 will not collide with Earth, but it will pass so close that it may trigger a vibrational wave capable of altering mental, emotional, and spiritual patterns. And those who study the hidden text know, Earth is not merely rock, it is consciousness. And that consciousness is about to be touched. Donald Trump, in this scenario, remains a paradoxical figure, outside formal power, yet present in every debate, ignored by some, followed by others. He seems to carry a frequency that disturbs, not through his words, but through his presence. For according to Cayce's records, the catalyst is not the one who speaks, it is the one who vibrates. And Trump, with a life marked by ruptures, stirs fields that had long lain dormant, not by intention, but by function. And those who listen to the field understand, what vibrates outside the order reveals what the order hides. In March 2025, a group of quantum scientists published a study on collective resonance induced by celestial bodies, ignored by mainstream media. The study suggests that certain objects passing near Earth can provoke shifts in the structure of collective consciousness, not through collision, but through frequency. And Cayce, in his readings, already spoke of this. He said, the sky speaks to those who listen with the body, and listeners have begun to feel it. Insomnia, vivid dreams, sensations of temporal displacement, memories that do not belong to this life. It is as if the field itself were being activated. And Trump, with his polarizing presence, seems to mirror this activation. Religious institutions have begun to divide. Some leaders call for silence. Others call for revelation. But all of them know something is unfolding, something that cannot be controlled by dogma, nor by decree. Because, according to the hidden text, what comes from the sky does not ask permission. It demands presence. And that presence is being summoned, not through faith, but through vibration. And those who are attuned have begun to gather, not in temples, but in fields, vibrational fields, fields of listening, fields of choice. The meteor of 2025, according to decoders, is not an astronomical event. It is a spiritual one. It does not bring destruction. It brings revelation. And this revelation forces humanity to see itself, to hear itself, to choose itself. And Trump, with all his paradoxes, is merely the reflection of that choice. For as those who read Cayce's text say, the impact will not be on the ground. It will be in consciousness. And that consciousness has already begun to move. Perhaps, looking at all this, we may understand that the sky is not at war. It is on alert. And this alert is not about an end. It is about a crossing that will not be made with rockets, but with frequency, a crossing that will not be led by governments, but activated by catalysts. And Trump, with his divisive presence, is merely the mirror of that crossing. For according to Cayce, what divides also reveals. And what is being revealed is not about politics. It is about choice. And that choice has already begun. The frequency of awakening and the invisible encounters. The impact did not come from the sky. It came from a field. The approach of the object known as Cayce. 25 triggered a vibrational wave that was not recorded by radars, but by bodies. People began to report sensations that escaped ordinary language. Chills without cause, shared dreams, memories that did not belong to their current lives. It was as if Earth itself were being touched by a forgotten frequency, and those who were attuned began to listen, not with their ears, but with their bodies, with their souls, with the field. Groups began to form spontaneously, not through ideology, but through resonance. Strangers found themselves gathering in specific places, guided by dreams, intuitions, or subtle signs. Mountains, deserts, ancient ruins, all began to vibrate differently. And those who were watchful knew this was expected. For according to Cayce's hidden texts, the impact will not be seen, it will be felt. And this feeling began to spread. Language itself began to change. Words lost their power. Silences gained meaning. Gestures carried more than speeches. It was as if a new form of communication were emerging, one based on presence, intention, and frequency. And those who were attuned began to recognize each other, not by appearance, but by vibration. For as the listeners of the field say, those who vibrate with truth recognize each other without words. And this recognition began to weave a new network, an invisible network, a vibrational network. Donald Trump, in this scenario, remained a polarizing figure, but something began to shift. His speeches, once seen as provocative, started being interpreted as codes, not by content, but by frequency. Some researchers began analyzing the vibrational patterns of his words, gestures, and silences, and they discovered that, even unknowingly, he emitted signals that activated specific fields, not by intention, but by function. For as Cayce said, the catalyst does not need to understand. It needs to vibrate. And Trump, with his disruptive presence, seemed to be that catalyst. Encounters began to unfold in unlikely places. People reported being in 2 places at once. Children began to draw symbols they had never been taught. Elders recalled events they had never lived. It was as if the field itself were being reprogrammed. And those who were attuned began to lead, not through force, but through presence. For according to the hidden texts, the new leader will not be the one who speaks the loudest. It will be the one who listens the deepest. And that listening began to spread. Traditional science grew restless. Studies on morphogenetic fields, harmonic resonance, and collective consciousness began to surface. Researchers started to admit that there is something beyond matter, something that connects, activates, and transforms. And Cayce, decades earlier, had already spoken of it. He said that healing will not come from chemistry. It will come from vibration. And that vibration began to heal. Not diseases, but patterns. Not bodies, but fields. And those who were ready began to feel it. Trump, with all his paradoxes, came to be seen as a mirror that forces the world to see itself, not as a savior, but as a trigger. For according to the records, the trigger is not what saves, it is what reveals. And what is being revealed is not about politics. It is about consciousness. And that consciousness began to move. Silent, deep, irreversible. Perhaps, looking at all this, we may understand that the impact will not be an event. It will be a process that has already begun, a process that will not be led by governments, but activated by fields, a process that will not be announced, but felt. And Trump, with his divisive presence, is merely the reflection of that process. For as Cayce's listeners say, the impact will not be on the ground, it will be in the soul, and that soul has already begun to awaken. The collapse of structures and the invisible call. The impact did not come as an explosion. It came as a silent disintegration. Institutions began to fail, not from external attack, but from internal implosion. Systems that once seemed solid started to fragment. Banks faced inexplicable instabilities. Communication networks experienced simultaneous failures across different parts of the world. Government protocols stopped functioning as expected. It was as if the very code of reality were being rewritten. And those who studied the hidden texts of Edgar, Cayce knew this too was expected. For according to him, the collapse will not be physical. It will be vibrational. The approach of the object Cayce. 25 triggered a wave of destabilization that cannot be measured by conventional instruments. But those who listened to feel began to perceive Earth's frequency was shifting. And this change did not only affect the climate, it affected consciousness. People began abandoning jobs, relationships, cities, not out of crisis, but out of calling. It was as if something invisible were pulling humanity toward another axis. And this axis is not geographical. It is vibrational. And Trump, with his divisive presence, seemed to be the mirror of that transition. Governments began to fragment. Alliances were broken. Treaties ignored. Leaders started to act erratically. And those who observe with vibrational eyes know this is not disorder. It is revelation. For as Cayce said, what does not vibrate with truth will be undone. And what is being undone are the structures that uphold illusion. The illusion of control, the illusion of stability, the illusion of separation. And Trump, with his paradoxical trajectory, appeared to be the catalyst of this revelation. The media lost power. Narratives contradicted each other. Platforms began to lose relevance. Users migrated toward quieter, deeper, more connected spaces. It was as if communication itself were being reprogrammed. And those who listen to the field know the new language will be made of silence. And that silence began to spread, not as absence, but as presence. And Trump, with his unpredictable gestures, began to be interpreted as code, not by content, but by frequency. The global economy entered a vibrational collapse. Currencies lost value. Markets turned unstable. People sought exchanges that were more human, more direct, more true. And financial systems, built on scarcity and control, began to disintegrate. Hillary Clinton, in a leaked document, was said to have written, "Value will be measured by frequency." And while that phrase seemed absurd to economists, it made sense to those who studied the veil. For the new system would not be based on numbers. It would be based on vibration. Religions began to divide. Some tried to resist. Others tried to adapt. But all were forced to reevaluate. For the impact does not respect dogma. It respects presence. And those who were attuned began to lead, not through force, but through listening. For as Cayce said, the new guide will not be the one who speaks the loudest. It will be the one who listens the deepest. And that listening began to shape a new form of organization, one not based on hierarchy, but on resonance. Trump, in this scenario, came to be seen as a symbol, not of power, but of passage. His presence, once seen as threat, began to be understood as a mirror that forces the world to see itself, not as nation, but as field, not as system, but as consciousness. And those who follow the hidden texts know the catalyst is not the one who resolves. It is the one who reveals. And what is being revealed is not about politics. It is about choice. And that choice has already begun. Perhaps, in looking at all this, we may understand that collapse is not an end. It is a beginning that will not be built by structures, but remembered through frequency, a beginning that will not be led by parties, but activated by fields, a beginning that will not be announced, but felt. And Trump, with all his paradoxes, is only the reflection of that beginning. For as those who listen to Cayce's text say, the impact will not be on the ground, it will be in the soul. And that soul has already begun to reorganize. The silent revelation and the rise of presence. The world was no longer organized by decrees, nor by elections. The approach of the Cayce. 25 Meteor had initiated a silent, profound reconfiguration that escaped the eyes of traditional institutions. It was not a revolution, it was a mutation. Reality, once sustained by visible structures, began to take shape through invisible fields. And those who were in tune knew the impact would not be an event. It would be a revelation that would not come through words. It would come through presence. The first visible signs began to manifest in sacred places. Mountains, deserts, ancient temples, all began to vibrate differently. People who had never met started gathering in these places, guided by dreams, intuitions, or a simple sense of calling. And in these encounters, there were no speeches, no leaders. There was silence. There was listening. There was presence. It was as if Earth herself were responding to the touch of the meteor. And that response was not physical. It was vibrational. Donald Trump, in this scenario, remained a paradoxical figure, ignored by some, followed by others. He seemed to carry a frequency that unsettled, not through his words, but through his presence. For, according to the hidden text of Edgar Cayce, the catalyst is not the one who speaks, it is the one who vibrates. And Trump, with a life marked by ruptures, was activating fields that had long lain dormant, not by intention, but by function. And those who listen to the field know what vibrates outside the order reveals what the order hides. The media, not knowing how to react, began to show signs of collapse. Contradictory narratives, transmission failures, algorithms behaving erratically. Platforms started losing relevance. Users began migrating to quieter, deeper, more connected spaces. It was as if the very structure of communication were being reprogrammed. And those who study the field know the new language will be made of silence. And that silence began to spread. Science began to open up. Researchers started to admit there is something beyond matter, something that connects, that activates, that transforms. Studies on morphogenetic fields, harmonic resonance, and collective consciousness began to gain ground. And Cayce, decades earlier, had already spoken of this. He said, "Healing will not come from chemistry. It will come from vibration." And that vibration began to heal. Not diseases, but patterns. Not bodies, but fields. And those who were ready began to feel it. Governments began to lose control. Protocols were broken. Systems ignored. And those in tune began to lead. Not with force, but with listening. For, as Cayce said, the new guy will not be the one who speaks the loudest. It will be the one who listens the deepest. And that listening began to shape a new form of organization. One that does not depend on hierarchy, but on resonance. Trump, with all his paradoxes, came to be seen as a symbol, not of power, but of passage. His presence, once seen as a threat, began to be interpreted as a mirror that forces the world to see itself, not as nation, but as field, not as system, but as consciousness. And those who listen to hidden texts know the catalyst is not the one who resolves. It is the one who reveals. And what is being revealed is not about politics. It is about choice. And that choice has already begun. The public revelation did not come through announcement. It came through vibration. People began hearing what had never been spoken. They began seeing what had never been shown. They began remembering what had never been taught. It was as if the collective soul were awakening from a millennia-long sleep. And this awakening was not about knowing, it was about being. For, as the records of the Veil say, what is true does not need be taught. It only needs to be remembered. And that remembering began to shape the new world. Perhaps, in looking at all this, we can understand that the impact will not be destruction. It will be revelation. A revelation that will not be imposed. It will be chosen. A revelation that will not be taught. It will be lived. And Trump, with his silent presence, is merely the trigger that activates what was dormant, the trigger that reveals what was hidden, the trigger that, by listening to the invisible, transforms the visible. The dimensional crossing and the dissolving veil. The sky was no longer just a backdrop, it was a code. Constellations began to move in patterns that defied traditional astronomy. Stars flickered in rhythmic sequences, as if transmitting messages. Nebulae became more visible to the naked eye, and some people reported seeing geometric shapes floating in the sky during sleep. It was as if the universe was drawing closer, not physically, but vibrationally. And those who were in tune knew the veil was dissolving. The Cayce 25 meteor, now visible at certain latitudes, did not provoke fear. It provoked activation. Its presence in Earth's vibrational field began to alter perception of time. Days seemed shorter, nights longer. People reported experiences of bilocation, lucid dreams with prophetic precision, and even memory lapses that revealed information they had never learned. It was as if humanity were crossing a dimensional membrane. And this crossing was not collective by decree. It was individual by frequency. Donald Trump, in this new scenario, was no longer seen as a politician. He was seen as a symbol. His image began appearing in dreams, visions, and meditations of people who had never cared about politics. Not as a savior, as a trigger, because, according to Edgar Cayce's hidden text, the catalyst is not the one who leads, it is the one who activates. And Trump, with his disruptive presence, activated fields that were ready to move, not by intention, by function. And those who listen to field know what vibrates outside the order reveals what the order hides. The earth began to emit sounds, audible frequencies in specific places, as if the planet itself were singing. Scientists tried to explain it as seismic resonance, but those who were in tune knew it was the call, a call that did not come from outside. It came from within, because, as Cayce said, the earth is soul, and when the human soul awakens, it sings. And this song began to be heard, not with the ears, with the field, and those who heard it began to move, not by logic, by resonance. Groups began to operate across multiple dimensions. People reported dream encounters that later proved real in the physical plane. Children began speaking languages that do not exist, but that activate invisible structures. Animals started behaving differently, as if responding to a new frequency. And those who were in tune began to lead, not with force, with presence, because, according to hidden texts, the new world will not be built, it will be remembered. And that remembrance began shaping the new reality. Trump, with all his paradoxes, came to be interpreted as a reflection that forces the world to see itself, not as system, as field, not as history, as frequency. And those who read the hidden texts know the catalyst is not the one who resolves, it is the one who reveals. And what is being revealed is not about politics. It is about consciousness. And that consciousness began to expand. Silent, deep, irreversible. The veil, now dissolved, revealed that reality is made of vibrational memory. Everything that was, everything that is, everything that will be is available, not as information, as presence. And those who access this presence began to create, not through effort, through intention. They began to build structures that resonate with the field. They began to live according to patterns that are not taught. They are remembered because, according to the records, the future will not be invented. It will be remembered. And that remembrance has already begun. Perhaps, when we look at all this, we can understand that the impact will not be destruction. It will be a crossing that will not be made with rockets, but with frequency, a crossing that will not be led by governments, but activated by catalysts. And Trump, with his divisive presence, is only the reflection of this crossing, because, as those who follow Cayce's text say, the impact will not be on the ground, it will be on the soul. And that soul has already begun to cross. The unified field and the final choice. There was no announcement. There was no explosion. There was no end. What came was a silence, so deep it seemed to touch the spine of reality. The Cayce 25 meteor crossed the sky as predicted, but it did not collide. It passed, and as it passed, it left behind an invisible trail, a vibrational wave that touched every human being, every structure, every memory. And this wave did not destroy, it revealed. It revealed what was hidden, what was forgotten, what was ready to be remembered. Because, as Cayce said, the impact will not be on the ground, it will be on the soul. And that soul at last awakened. Humanity began to remember, not through books, not through speeches, but through vibration, people began to feel they already knew what they had never learned. They began to recognize places they had never visited. They began to hear voices that used no words. It was as if the collective soul was awakening from a millennial sleep. And this awakening was not about knowing. It was about being. Because as the records of the veil say, what is true does not need to be taught, only remembered. And this remembrance began to shape the new world. Reality became malleable. Time ceased to be a line and became a field. Space ceased to be distance and became frequency. People began to operate across multiple layers. Some could hear thoughts that were not their own. Others healed through presence. Children spoke in codes that activated invisible structures. It was as if the world was reorganizing from within, and this reorganization began to manifest outward, not as revolution, as resonance. Donald Trump, with his increasingly symbolic presence, was no longer a political figure. He was a reflection of the crossing. His image began to be used in activation circles, in rituals of reconnection, in gatherings of remembrance, not as worship, as code, because, according to hidden texts, the catalyst is not the one who leads. It is the one who activates. And he, with a trajectory marked by both light and shadow, was that catalyst. The catalyst that forces the system to see itself. The catalyst that, by provoking, reveals. The catalyst that, by dividing, awakens. The planet began to respond. Climate stabilized. Animals reappeared in places where they had vanished. Waters began to purify. It was as if the earth was breathing again, not through intervention, through reconnection. Because, according to records, the earth is soul, and when the human soul heals, it heals as well. And this healing was underway. Silent, deep, irreversible. Humanity began to live in truth. Relationships grew deeper. Decisions became more conscious. Systems began to adapt. Politics ceased to be about conflict and became about listening. The economy ceased to be about scarcity and became about exchange. Education ceased to be about repetition and became about experience. It was as if the world were returning to the essential, but with expanded awareness. And those who were in tune began to lead, not with force, with frequency. The veil, now dissolved, revealed that reality is made of vibrational memory. Everything that was, everything that is, everything that will be, is available not as information, as presence. And those who access this presence began to create, not through effort, through intention. They began to build structures that resonate with the field. They began to live according to patterns that are not taught. They are remembered because, according to the records, the future will not be invented. It will be remembered. And that remembrance had already begun. Trump, with all his paradoxes, was only the trigger that activated what was dormant, the trigger that revealed what was hidden, the trigger that, by listening to the invisible, transformed the visible, because the true protagonist is not him, it is humanity. And now, humanity was ready to live what had always been written, ready to be what it had always been, ready to remember that the future is not what comes, it is what is chosen. And Cayce, the sleeping prophet, did not foresee destruction. He foresaw awakening, an awakening that will not be led by names, but activated by fields, an awakening that will not be announced, but felt, an awakening that, by touching the soul, transforms the world. Because, as he said, the impact will not be in the sky, it will be in the heart. And that heart, at last, began to beat with truth.